Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox. Today is chapter 21, Spy in the Swedish Camp, and the date is April to June, the year 1709. Poltava was a Russian stronghold. The Russian army had taken it over just the year before. Its city walls were only earth and wood, but the Russians had put 91 cannon around them, and there was a guard of several thousand Russians inside. While Charles was waiting for the friendly forces to arrive, he decided to lay siege to the town, sealing it off from supplies, pounding it with cannon every day, although that used up their precious supplies of gunpowder. For 6 weeks, as the weather grew hotter and steamier, the Swedes lay siege to Poltava, blasting it with cannonballs, digging trenches ever nearer the walls, and dying as the Russian defenders shot at them from the city walls, as their wounds rotted in the sticky heat, as their food ran out and they had to make do with horse meat and black bread. But the Russians inside Poltava were in trouble too, as their supplies of food and ammunition inside the sealed-off town grew lower and lower, and the Swedish trenches came nearer and nearer to the city walls. Meanwhile, the rest of the Russian army were coming closer, but between them and the town of Poltava lay a wide marshy river with steep high banks, hard to cross at any time, but almost impossible in the teeth of an enemy army. Poltava and the Swedish camp were on its west bank. The main Russian army were to the east of the river, a good couple of miles away. Even the Russian cannon were useless. The river was too wide for cannonballs to hit the Swedish camp. And Peter was on his way up from checking on his ships by the Black Sea. His generals waited. They had another reason to wait. Over 5,000 more troops were expected to join them in a few weeks at the latest. On June 4th, Peter arrived. Everyone could sense that this time was different. This time wasn't a matter of harassing the edges of each other's armies, or of a few divisions of either army meeting in battle. This time both armies were assembled, more or less at full strength, each led by its own king, within one small patch of countryside. This time it was make or break. But still Peter hesitated, sending small groups of men up and down the river, spying and shooting at the far side. He even sent a bigger force right across the river, using the nearest ford 7 miles to the north. But they quickly withdrew when the Swedes fought back strongly. Abraham was nearly beside himself with impatience. "Come on, Tsar Peter. What are you waiting for this time? Let's get in there and at them." One hot night, nearly 2 weeks after Peter had arrived at Poltava, he was sitting with his generals outside his stuffy little tent. Although it was late, it was not yet completely dark, even this far south. The summer nights were very short. Abraham sat on the ground with a lamp, slate, and chalk, ready to take notes and bursting to know what decisions would be made. "If we don't attack, Poltava's going to fall for sure," said Peter heavily. "Then it'll become a secure headquarters for that Swede, which is something we can do without, especially if the Poles and the Turks do send them supporting forces. Poltava would make a very dangerous enemy base indeed, but I'm not willing to risk my whole army. That river is a terrible barrier to cross. We've tried it already and had our noses bloodied. My feeling is that we wait until the extra forces arrive. It should only be another week or two." The generals discussed the matter further, but no one liked to speak against the Tsar, and the meeting ended. Abraham was too angry and dissatisfied to sleep. He didn't even undress, but wandered around the camp, his brain whirling with plans and ideas. "Poltava's about to fall. The Swedes are just hungry, ragged scarecrows. The Tsar said it so himself. Our army's much bigger than theirs. When are we going to get a better chance than this? We're bound to win. There isn't even a risk. Maybe if I could prove to the Tsar that the Swedes are in a mess, he'd make up his mind to attack, but how to do that?" Everywhere men were sitting outside their tents, chatting quietly. It was too hot to sleep, and besides, everyone was on edge. They all knew that after 9 years of on and off fighting, of 100 little battles, and games of hide and seek. The time was coming for the big one, the battle that would decide everything for Russia, the battle that might see Charles of Sweden marching victorious to Moscow and crowning himself Tsar, or the battle that would finish him off for good. And they knew that their army was bigger, healthier, better fed, and much better equipped than Charles's army. Voices and laughter floated across at Abraham as soldiers spotted him through the summer twilight. "Look, there's the Tsar's African. Come and join us, African. Come and bring us good luck." But Abraham was in no mood for chat. He made his way through the camp toward the river and stood on the edge of the low, crumbly bank. There, over on the other side, loomed the walls of Poltava, dark against the last light of the long summer evening, a low mass of houses huddled all around their base. The Swedes seemed as wakeful as their enemy. Here and there a lamp glowed, and there was the faint murmur of thousands of sleeping men keeping busy, moving, talking, mending their kits, grooming their horses. Somewhere in Poltava a clock struck 11, and the clear sound floated across the river. A bright, almost full moon had risen. Suddenly Abraham decided what to do. He darted back to his own tent and changed out of his red and green uniform into plain gray trousers, shirt and sash. He took his cloak, even though it was such a hot night. Then he went over to where the horses were stabled. As he was a footman regiment, and not with the cavalry, he never had the chance to ride into battle except in his dreams, but he had been an excellent rider as a little boy, and in Russia he'd always grabbed any chance to ride when he could. He chose a quiet-looking mare, saddled her up, wrapped his cloak around his head and face, and headed north. "I reckon I've got about 4 hours of near darkness to get over to their camp and back across the river. We'll see what we can see." Even now that the twilight had faded, the moon was so bright that he could see his way quite clearly and be seen. He galloped along the top of the steep river bank, high above the marshy shores and muddy waters. At last he reached the ford, 7 miles away, where part of the Russian army had crossed a few days before, but had been pushed back again by the Swedes. "I daren't risk riding across. I'll be seen. They're bound to have lookouts here. Better tie the mare up in the shadows and slip across as quietly as I can." He took off his breeches, stockings, and boots, made them into a bundle inside his cloak, and slipped into the warm, muddy water, holding the bundle over his head. The bottom was soft and slippery, and the water reached his waist, but he crossed without difficulty. Then he dressed again, and keeping his eyes skinned for guards and lookouts, he began to run south along the other river bank, far steeper on this side, back down toward Poltava and the Swedish camp. He kept his eyes open for hiding places, and there were plenty. Thick patches of forest, steep gorges in the ground, but until the end he saw no one. It was a long haul, some 7 miles, but he was strong and fit, and he kept up a long, fast, steady stride. The problem was where to go, what to do, when he reached the Swedish camp. Ahead of him, black against the moonlit sky, he could see the great mound of Poltava walls, with here and there a watchman's lamp twinkling, and he thought of his fellow Russians trapped inside. Then Abraham came toward the houses of the lower town outside the walls, all taken over by lodgings by the Swedes. Beyond, further away from the river, was the main Swedish camp. Here surely he would find watchmen. He waited till his fast panting breath had quieted down. Slowly, absolutely silently, slipping from shadow to shadow, using trees and bushes as cover, sliding in and out of ditches, he made his way nearer and nearer the town, and at last he slunk into one of its alleyways, behind the backs of 2 lookouts who were standing absorbed in deep discussion. "Somewhere among these houses is the one which King Charles has chosen for himself." The story had found its way even to the Russian side of the river, of how Charles had deliberately picked a house so close to the fortress that its walls were all pockmarked with bullet holes and smashed with cannonballs from the Russian guns on the town walls. Abraham placed himself in the shadow of a house wall and looked at the silvery moonlight scene ahead of him. Although It was the dead of night. He could hear quiet movements and voices everywhere. Here, too, men found it hard to sleep for the heat and for the thinking about what the next days would bring. He could see the ghostly forms of soldiers, pale in their war-torn uniforms, sitting in the doorways or wandering up and down the alleyways, discussing with a kind of urgency in their voices. And although Abraham couldn't pick out a word that was said, he thought he could smell fear in the warm night air, a panic that was barely under control. There were guards, too, standing at street corners on the lookout. He wrapped his cloak round his head and shoulders like a shawl, pulling it over his forehead to throw a deep shadow across his face. At all costs, no one must see that he was a foreigner. Slowly but firmly, so that no one would think him unaware of his way, and keeping in the shadows where he could, Abraham walked up the alleyway toward the town walls, and then, faced with a choice of left or right, turned right along the crooked rows of houses and inns nearest to the fortress and the Russian guns. The houses were all single-story, their windows and shutters thrown wide open against the stiff, stuffy heat. From nearly every house came the glow of lamp or candlelight and the sound of voices. The whole Swedish army seemed awake. As Abraham crept past, he peered as discreetly as he could through every window, searching for any clue. What he did see again and again as he glanced quickly in through each window and moved on before he could be spotted was men in uniforms, so faded and parched that he could hardly identify the Swedish colors of blue and yellow, men thin and sick and most of all despairing, whispering anxiously, urgently among themselves, their pale faces frowning with worry. How different, thought Abraham, from the cheerful soldiers back on his side of the river. This is an army that's lost its nerve. There's no way this army believes it's the finest in all of Europe. They've been through too much. Surely we're in with a good chance of beating them now. And Abraham felt a quick rush of hope inside him at the thought of fighting an army that had lost hope. But he quickly moved on into the next pool of shadows in case he should be challenged. Already, he wondered if over in the east, behind the dark mass of the Poltava walls, past the river and his own camp, the sky was beginning to grow lighter, and one place where he did not want daylight to find him was the enemy camp. A clock struck 1, 2, 3 times. Suddenly Abraham froze. Not far ahead along the alleyway stood 2 guards, but not on lookout at a street corner this time. These guards were keeping watch on a doorway, the doorway of a large solid brick house, though one much blasted by the Russian guns on the town walls. Could this maybe be the home of King Charles himself? Trying not to look shifty, Abraham slipped along the alley to the first window of the house, stood up on tiptoe and peeped in, and there by the glow of oil lamps he saw the enemy king at last. Not rearing up on a stallion this time, not slashing and stabbing with his sword, but lying in his white nightshirt on a blood-stained bed, his left foot bloody and bandaged, his eyes closed, his face gray and clammy with sweat, his blond hair matted. Round the young king stood or sat, Abraham supposed, his generals, their blue and yellow uniforms smarter and more splendid than the common soldiers, their decorations gleaming, but on their faces exactly the same expressions of loss and anxiety as Abraham had seen in the humbler rooms in the town. The king did not seem to be asleep. He groaned and tossed unconscious in a fever, while their generals muttered dismay and shook their heads. Oh, this is the end for the Swedes, and they know it. Without him to lead, they're done for. Peter must make his mind up to go into battle when he knows this. Pity, though, that they'll never meet Charles in battle now after all. One of the soldiers on guard duty outside the king's door suddenly turned and called out sharply in Abraham's direction. Abraham lifted his right hand in a kind of clumsy wave and turned back as calmly and steadily as he could manage, retracing his steps the way he had come. The guard gave another shout. Abraham simply carried on. For a moment there was stillness behind him, and he thought he was getting away with it. But then he heard the man's voice calling out again and again, and the thud of boots on the dry earth of the lane. He broke into a run and darted along the alleyways, away from the huge pile of the town's walls toward the countryside. Behind him, he could hear not just one man running, but the heavy pounding of many feet. There was the sudden crack of a pistol shot over his shoulder. His cloak was getting in the way, and he flung it off. I'll never keep ahead of them. It's a 7-mile run along the west bank of the river till I can get back to the ford. I'll never keep ahead of them. They're bound to fetch themselves horses. I could hide in the forest or in a ditch, but how long for? They'll find me in the end, and I must take Peter this news while it's still hot before he hears it from anyone else. By now he had got to the edge of the town. Ahead of him lay those long miles of countryside before the river ford, where he'd left the mare. Behind him, he could hear the thud, thud, thud of the Swedish soldiers on his trail. In a flash, Abraham made up his mind. There was another way. Just nearby, to the east of the town walls, was the river. No ford here, as the bank was a steep cliff, a good 200 feet high, but at least it was nearby. He dashed madly across the rough grass and between bushes and trees, doubling up low to try and make himself harder to see. Behind him was still the crashing and thudding of Swedish boots. Then there was the crack, once, again, of pistol fire, the whistle of a bullet somewhere above his head, and then again and again. He reached the edge of the cliff, flung himself flat on the grass, and looked at what was below and in front of him. He just had time to take in, 200 feet below, wide, dark patches that he supposed were reeds and rough grass, and then stretches of water or mud that shone greasily in the thin light of dawn. Then another bullet whistled over his head. Clutching hold of 2 tufts of grass, he swiftly tumbled himself over the edge and felt for a foothold. The cliffside was crumbly and soft, with plenty of little ledges and hollows, and here and there bushy plants growing out of it, and he was soon well down along below the cliff edge, clambering and sliding as fast as he could, pressing his chest and stomach flat against the soft earth, bits of cliffside coming away with his hands and feet. All the time Abraham was looking down, not up, but he could hear yells above him, and every now and then a clod of earth would fall down from a cliff edge as the Swedes stamped up and down, or a bullet would whiz down somewhere behind his back toward the marsh below. He let himself fall the last 10 feet or so, squelching on all fours into the muddy edge of the river, and began to wade through the ooze across to the Russian side. Sometimes he stepped up onto the firm foothold of the hard clump of grass. Sometimes he sank into the slime up to his thighs, and after he felt a few bullets fly past not too far away and plop into the water, he was happy to let himself fall headlong into the swamp and carry on half crawling, half wallowing, knowing that he was now just a shapeless lump of mud, perfectly camouflaged against the Swedish marksmen on the cliff top. Another kind of danger lay ahead. Of course, the deeper waters of the real river. Abraham's stomach tightened in panic at the thought of swimming. In all these years, he had never got used to the thought of deep water. Too many memories. In the growing light, he kept his eyes open for something to use as a float, and soon he grabbed a piece of plank he found stuck in a bush. At last he felt the water swirling around him faster and deeper, and his feet no longer touching any kind of bottom. His paddling was turning into real swimming. Just managing to keep his panic under control, he splashed his way across the broad stretch of dark, warm water, a powerful current tugging him over and downstream until he reached the marshy eastern shore. Soon Abraham was scrambling up the riverbank, much lower, fortunately, than the one on the western side, and dripped and squished his way into the Russian camp, just as a bright, clear dawn was breaking behind it. A cock crowed, and he felt like shouting out loud to himself. He found Peter sitting on a camp stool outside his tent, shaving, a page boy holding a basin of foamy water under his chin. The Tsar stared at him. "Good heavens, lad! What pond have you been sleeping in?" I've come from the Swedish side of the river, your majesty," panted Abraham. "I've got good news, important news." Peter handed his razor to the page boy. Yes, spit it out! Spit it out! King Charles is desperately ill. He's been shot in the foot. He's got a fever. There's no way he could lead his army. The Swedes' nerve is completely gone. They look completely lost without him. Well, we'll hear the whole story later of how the devil you found out When we move the entire army across starting today, the time has truly come for our armies to meet. You will be rewarded, boy. You will be rewarded. Never fear." And he gave Abraham a clasp across his muddy shoulders that nearly knocked him flying. That's the end of chapter 21.